The tweet that once shook the world now sits frozen in time, a screenshot buried under 1,000 news cycles, remembered not for its thunder, but for the echo that followed. What was meant to dominate became a lesson. What was meant to divide became a mirror. The camera drifts across that same timeline. Hashtags faded, headlines archived, but one phrase still glowing: no single nation, however great, owns the world's game. Voiceover, calm and resolute. In an age of outrage, restraint is rebellion. When the world shouts, dignity whispers. And somehow, it's the whisper that lasts. Clips replay in soft montage, the press room applause, children running on fields, the sunset over a quiet stadium. The noise fades into a heartbeat, steady, human, collective. Because this story was never just about a letter or a tweet. It was about us. How we choose to speak, how we choose to stand, how we choose to play. The narrator's tone shifts from reflective to inviting, carrying warmth and resolve. If this story reminded you that class can still conquer chaos, share it. Let others remember that respect isn't weakness, it's leadership. Subscribe for more stories where dignity triumphs over ego and where words, not weapons, decide the day. A final image, the empty football pitch under twilight, goalposts gleaming like silent sentinels. The faint echo of a crowd rises, cheers, then stillness. Then, just before the screen fades to black, a final line appears, because sometimes the greatest victories are the ones played with grace. Fade out. Silence. The letter hadn't even finished trending before the internet turned it into theater. Within hours, memes flooded every feed, Trump's tweets reimagined as FIFA press cards, the line, "No single nation owns the world's game," set to orchestral music. One viral clip spliced together the president's speech cadence with stadium chants, building to a final roar of "Goal!" It was equal parts mockery and marvel, politics remixed into poetry by the crowd. By noon, the FIFA clapback and the world's game were everywhere. Commentators called it a cultural earthquake. Someone animated the letter into a mock movie trailer. In a world divided by borders, one organization dared to pass the ball back to humanity. The tagline read simply, "Coming to a pitch near you." But amid the humor, the conversation deepened. Sports journalists began unpacking what had just happened. It wasn't just a PR duel. It was precedent. A reminder that even the grandest political figure could be humbled by an institution that answered not to any nation, but to billions of fans. On ESPN, a panelist said, "FIFA didn't take sides. It reminded us what side we're supposed to be on, the human one." In Europe, op-eds called it a quiet revolution of tone. In South America, broadcasters replayed the FIFA statement between highlight reels, describing it as a lesson in grace. From Tokyo to Toronto, it became less about football and more about what football represented: unity, ownership, identity. The world had found its metaphor. Late-night comedians couldn't resist. One joked, "Trump tried to red card FIFA. They VAR reviewed his entire presidency." Another pulled out a referee whistle and said, "Play on!" The audience erupted, but beneath the laughter was something heavier, a sense that a line had been crossed and then corrected. And then came the endorsements that mattered. Players, actual stars of the sport, began weighing in. Lionel Messi posted a simple line, "The game is for everyone." Megan Rapinoe retweeted FIFA's letter with 3 clapping emojis. Cristiano Ronaldo shared a photo of kids playing barefoot in Madeira, captioned, "This is why we play." The response transcended politics. It became cultural oxygen. Suddenly, the story wasn't about a feud, it was about belonging. For immigrants, the children of two worlds, this moment hit differently. It was as if the planet had collectively said, "Your passion isn't foreign. It's shared." Community clubs across the U.S. felt it first. Coaches printed the quote on banners. Parents showed their kids the letter not for politics, but for pride. "See?" one father told his son in a Texas suburb, pointing to the line. "That's why no one owns this game. Not presidents, not politicians, just us." In Chicago, a bar full of Mexican and American fans clinked glasses under a TV looping the headline, "FIFA defends the world's game." A Pakistani Uber driver in New York played commentary on his phone between rides. In London, a Nigerian immigrant watching from a cafe smiled quietly and said, "For once, it feels like someone spoke for us." It wasn't the letter alone, it was what it represented. Calm power in an age of noise. Dignity reclaiming center stage. The idea that strength isn't always the loudest voice, but the one that chooses when to speak. And yet, beneath the global applause, there was reflection. Analysts wondered if this moment would shift how institutions respond to populism. If the world had just seen the first diplomatic viral moment of the digital age. It wasn't confrontation, one political strategist noted. It was containment, through class. Meanwhile, at youth soccer fields around the world, life continued. Cleats scuffed dirt, shouts echoed. Kids chased the ball with the same wild joy that had outlived wars, empires, and borders. In a small town in Kansas, a teenage girl wearing a U.S. jersey and a hijab scored a goal and ran with her arms open wide. Her teammates cheered, not because of a headline, but because she had reminded them why the game mattered. A boy watching, from the sideline, asked his coach what the big FIFA story was about. The coach smiled and said, "It's about respect, kid. For the game, for people, for each other." And as the sun set over fields from Zurich to Zambia, from Rio to Riyadh, the echoes of that letter still lingered. It had started as a political spat and ended as a sermon in sportsmanship. The laughter online began to fade, replaced by something quieter. Pride. Not the chest-beating kind, but the steady, grounded pride of people who realized that even in chaos, civility could still win. The story had begun with outrage. It now rested in reflection. But beyond the laughter and headlines came a moral wake-up call. In the days that followed, the noise softened. The memes stopped trending. The pundits moved on. But something remained. A quiet lesson, humming beneath the surface like a heartbeat the world could suddenly hear again. For once, the story hadn't ended with a winner and a loser, but with a mirror that showed the difference between control and influence, between noise and respect, between the power to demand attention and the grace to deserve it. FIFA's response had not been perfect, nor was it meant to be. The organization carried its own scars, its history of corruption and reform still visible, but that was precisely what made its composure resonate. This wasn't moral superiority, it was maturity. The calm that comes not from innocence, but from learning the hard way how much noise costs. A journalist on Sky Sports put it best: "Power isn't in the threat, it's in the tone." The line spread almost as fast as the original tweet had. Because it said what everyone already felt, that shouting may win the moment, but grace wins the memory. The president's words had reached millions. FIFA's words had reached meaning. In that contrast, fury versus finesse, ego versus elegance, the world rediscovered something it had nearly forgotten. That diplomacy isn't weakness. That restraint isn't surrender. That true leadership doesn't need to declare victory. It simply earns it. It was as if the letter had reminded humanity of its own pulse, that civility still mattered, that words could still carry weight without volume. In every cafe, newsroom, and family WhatsApp chat, the same conversation unfolded. When did we start mistaking shouting for strength? FIFA hadn't just defended its autonomy, it had demonstrated that global unity wasn't a relic of the past. It was still possible, still alive, still worth defending. The world's game had once again proven it belonged to everyone, not to nations, but to people. And that realization hit especially deep in divided places. Border towns, immigrant neighborhoods, classrooms where flags hung side by side. Because if football could survive politics, maybe humanity could too. The story closed not with applause, but with quiet understanding. A camera might pan now across a lonely football field at sunset, goal posts standing in silhouette, their metal frames cutting into a sky brushed with gold. The pitch is empty, yet full, every blade of grass whispering the same truth. Borders may divide maps, but they can't divide meaning. Somewhere, a child runs across the field, chasing a ball that rolls lazily toward the goal. No anthem plays. No flag waves. Just the sound of breath, heartbeat, and motion. The universal rhythm that connects every player, every nation, every generation. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about FIFA or Trump. It was a story about tone, and the timeless truth that dignity will always outplay ego. When the world looked back on this moment, few would remember the tweet, but millions would remember the letter, the tone, the pause, the choice to rise instead of react. And in that choice, the world's game had done something rare. It had reminded humanity what victory really looks like. Not in control, not in conquest, but in calm, in unity, in the quiet power of respect. The room hummed before the microphones even turned on. That thick, electric kind of silence that always comes before a global moment. Reporters shuffled papers, adjusted earpieces, whispered translations in half a dozen languages. Every camera was trained on the FIFA logo behind the podium, its golden letters gleaming like they knew something the world didn't. The spokesperson stepped out, composed, expressionless, the kind of calm that cuts through noise like glass through smoke. She adjusted the microphone, took one slow breath, and began. Good morning. FIFA reaffirms that the World Cup is not a place for threats, but for cooperation. The line fell like a stone in water, still, soft, but rippling outward. Reporters froze mid-note. The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of centuries of diplomacy. It wasn't just a response. It was a reminder. Flashes erupted. The next question came fast. Is this directed at President Trump? The spokesperson didn't blink. FIFA does not address individuals, she said, her tone poised. We address principles. That was the moment the split screen began. On one side, Zurich, still polished, precise. On the other, Washington, chaotic, impulsive, glowing blue in the light of a phone screen. Within minutes, Trump's response appeared on Twitter. FIFA should worry less about politics and more about security. America's safety isn't negotiable. And just like that, the stage was set, restraint versus reaction, diplomacy versus defiance. Cable news scrambled. CNN played the clip on loop. Fox called it FIFA's overreach. BBC ran with FIFA pushes back. Hashtags collided mid-air. Respect. The game surged in Europe and Latin America, while the Hawks America first thundered through U.S. feeds. Comment sections turned into digital battlegrounds, but in Zurich, no one moved. The statement had been delivered. The rest, Infantino believed, was noise. The kind of noise that burns hot and dies fast. Still, around the world, the moment had texture. You could feel it in the tension of pundits' voices, in the awkward pauses of White House briefings, in the unease of diplomats who suddenly realized they were watching a power shift happen in real time. The beauty of FIFA's tone was that it didn't shout. It didn't accuse. It didn't need to. It was the verbal equivalent of someone calmly placing a chess piece down while their opponent slammed the table. Even within the U.S., some commentators admired it. That's what professionalism looks like, one ESPN anchor said on air. You don't match noise with noise. You outlast it. In immigrant households from New Jersey to Nairobi, people nodded. To them, it wasn't just about soccer. It was about dignity, about watching someone face arrogance without losing their grace. A soft-spoken institution reminding a loud world that respect doesn't need volume. Meanwhile, in Washington, aides scrambled to soften the fallout. The press corps peppered the president's team with questions. Will this affect World Cup hosting plans? Was this tweet authorized? They dodged, rephrased, smiled too tightly. The spectacle was spinning faster than they could manage. At FIFA's headquarters, Infantino watched the replay once, twice. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded. The first move had landed exactly as planned. Calm beats chaos. But for all the commentary, all the trending hashtags, and all the fiery debates, one thing escaped immediate notice, buried halfway through FIFA's official statement. Past the diplomacy, past the polite reaffirmations, was a single razor-sharp sentence. It was brief, almost hidden in plain sight, but its meaning was unmistakable. It read, "No nation, however great, may claim ownership of the world's game," a sentence so measured, so surgical, that it cut deeper than any direct attack could. A line destined to echo across talk shows, sports bars, and political roundtables. And as it began to circulate, screens everywhere paused on that one line. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath, the silence before the reaction. Because buried in those 12 words was something far more powerful than anger. It was a quiet challenge, a message louder than any tweet. It arrived just before dawn in Washington, a white envelope with the FIFA crest, delivered not through press release or leak, but through official diplomatic channels. No all-caps tweets, no TV drama, just a letter, quiet, formal, deliberate. By sunrise, it was everywhere. News anchors held up printed copies like holy texts. The headline across CNN read, "FIFA responds to Trump with elegance." On BBC, the letter heard around the world. Even Fox, usually combative, called it surprisingly measured. Inside, the tone was unmistakably surgical. No anger, no defensiveness. Just the kind of disciplined prose that could only come from an organization that had weathered decades of scandal and rebuilt itself from the ashes. It began simply, "FIFA appreciates the United States' commitment to the safety of all athletes, fans, and officials. Security is not the concern of one nation, but the shared duty of all who believe in sport as a bridge, not a wall." Then came the sentence, the one that would define the week, the month, maybe even the decade. "No single nation, however great, owns the world's game." The room fell silent the moment it was read on air. Not the awkward silence of confusion, but the heavy kind. The silence that follows when truth has just walked into the room and taken a seat. Pundits paused mid-analysis. Anchors leaned back. Even the scrolling tickers seemed to slow down. And then came the ripple. Within hours, European foreign ministers were calling it the classiest rebuke of the decade. Brazil's sports minister tweeted, "This is how you respond, not with fire, but with finesse." In London, one columnist wrote, "FIFA didn't clap back. They conducted a symphony." But in the United States, the tone was conflicted. On one hand, there was pride. Pride that America mattered enough to move the world's largest sport into statement mode. On the other, there was embarrassment, that a global institution had to remind Washington what diplomacy sounds like. Morning talk shows split down predictable lines. One anchor on MSNBC called it a gentle masterpiece. Another on Fox shot back, "Globalists lecturing us again." Twitter turned the letter's final line into a meme, gold text over a slow-motion replay of Trump at a rally. The words "no one owns the game" looping beneath applause. But beyond the noise, something deeper was shifting. For years, Trump had mastered the art of narrative control. He knew how to dominate headlines, drown out nuance, and make outrage the oxygen of every conversation. But this time, the outrage didn't feed him. It starved him. The letter was like a mirror held up to noise. Every time a new tweet appeared about America's right to lead or ungrateful organizations, the words seemed smaller, less commanding. The public had already seen what dignity looked like. They'd tasted the contrast. In press briefings, reporters pressed White House aides with the same question, "Does the president regret the tweet?" The answers were mechanical. "We stand by our position. We're focused on ensuring safety. This isn't about politics." But the fire was gone. The confidence that once powered the combative tone had turned into something else, something brittle. And on the other side of the ocean, Zurich stood still. The FIFA building, sleek glass and stone perched above the quiet lake, looked like a temple that had just completed its ritual. No gloating, no follow-up statement, just stillness, because in their silence they'd already said everything. Journalists who'd once mocked FIFA's bureaucracy now called it an institution reborn. Analysts on Al Jazeera praised its moral precision. Even The Economist ran a headline that read, "FIFA, from scandal to statesmanship." The power dynamic had flipped. The loudest man in global politics had been humbled, not by force, not by exposure, but by eloquence. And it wasn't just political, it was emotional. In immigrant households across the U.S., parents who'd grown up watching football on flickering TVs in Karachi, Lagos, or Buenos Aires felt something stir. Here was an institution, and long distrusted, often criticized, standing up for their game, their culture, their identity. Without a flag, without borders, without shouting, it wasn't just FIFA's win. It was theirs. Late-night shows couldn't resist dramatizing it. One host on The Daily Show held up the letter and said, "This is how you deliver a clapback, in Times New Roman." The audience roared. Even conservative commentators grudgingly admitted its craftsmanship. "It's hard to argue with that kind of precision," one said on air. "It's not just what they said, it's how they said it." And as the media storm churned, a subtle truth emerged. The era of outrage had met its match in the art of restraint. For all his bluster, Trump's empire was built on reaction, on keeping opponents talking, defending, explaining. But FIFA hadn't explained. It had declared. With 12 words, it had reclaimed moral high ground not through might, but through grace. The image that dominated the night was not of Trump or his tweets. It was of that letter, framed under studio lights, with the FIFA seal glinting under camera flash. Analysts called it the mic drop heard around the world. Even in Washington, some aides privately admitted admiration. "It was beautiful," one said off the record. "Infuriating, but beautiful." And as the week ended, something rare happened. The noise faded. The news cycle moved on, not because the story was over, but because there was nothing left to add. FIFA hadn't debated. It hadn't defended. It had delivered. It began with a flicker on a phone screen, 12:47 a.m. Washington time. A single tweet, short, defiant, unmistakable. If FIFA can't guarantee full U.S. control over security, maybe they shouldn't expect U.S. soil. Within minutes, it ricocheted across timelines, a digital thunderclap in the silence of the night. Cable news cut into programming. Anchors blinked, reading the words twice, as if to confirm they were real. "Is the president threatening FIFA?" one stammered. Another whispered, "That's unprecedented." Screens lit up across continents. In London, a BBC analyst murmured, "The World Cup isn't a campaign rally." In Doha, reporters looked stunned, unsure whether to laugh or worry. The global game, the one thing that united fans from Karachi to Kansas, suddenly found itself staring down the politics of power. Clips rolled in quick succession. Trump's profile picture, the White House at midnight, a spinning soccer ball fading into the American flag. Twitter's trending list morphed into chaos. FIFA threat, Dot's America First Cup, who owns the game? Late-night hosts rehearsed their monologues. Diplomats drafted statements. Somewhere, a FIFA aide in Zurich stared at the screen and whispered, "He didn't just say that." Within hours, every newsroom in the world was asking the same question. Was the United States threatening to pull the World Cup over security control? And more quietly, what did full U.S. control even mean? Pundits rushed to dissect it. Some called it strength. Others called it arrogance. But to the millions of immigrants, dreamers, and young fans who saw the World Cup as sacred ground, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like watching someone try to fence off a field that belonged to the world. Footage flashed, kids kicking balls under floodlights in Miami, Karachi, Lagos, voices murmuring across cultures united by disbelief. And then silence. The White House press team refused to clarify. FIFA remained quiet. For a day, the world waited, refreshing their feeds, wondering if the world's biggest sport was about to become its next political battlefield. But when the response finally came from the heart of Zurich, it wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was something far more devastating. What came next, no one saw coming. For years, the dream had been painted in red, white, and blue, the 2026 World Cup returning to American soil for the first time in decades. It wasn't just a tournament, it was a statement. Stadiums from Los Angeles to New York were already being redesigned, cities competing to host matches that would draw the world's gaze. The bid had been sold on unity, a joint North American effort with Canada and Mexico, symbolizing cooperation across borders. For millions of immigrants, it was proof that America could still open its arms and share its stage. But beneath the optimism, a quieter battle was brewing, one that would turn a celebration into confrontation. Security. FIFA's rules required collaboration with global agencies, Interpol, Europol, and national intelligence partners. To ensure safety, information flowed between countries, across borders, beyond flags. But to one man in the Oval Office, that sounded less like safety and more like surrender. Trump, ever the nationalist showman, saw the protocols as an insult to sovereignty. Foreign hands managing U.S. security, he told aides pacing behind his desk. Not happening. He believed hosting meant control, full, unshared, uncompromised control. What FIFA saw as cooperation, he saw as compromise. And that's how one late-night tweet became more than just a social media storm. It became a symbol of two worldviews colliding. Because FIFA, for all its controversies and history, stands on one unshakable creed. The game belongs to the world. It does not kneel to nations, politicians, or presidents. Its constitution, its ethics, its code of neutrality, all built to survive the egos of power. In Zurich, the headquarters stood like a glass fortress of globalism, untouchable, apolitical, deliberately above the flags that tried to claim it. Meanwhile, in Washington, talk shows exploded with analysis. Supporters praised Trump's tough stance against foreign influence. Critics warned it was yet another act of isolationism dressed as patriotism. But outside the spin rooms and microphones, the heart of the issue pulsed stronger than ever. Was America still capable of sharing the global stage it once built? Footage rolled of construction crews breaking ground on future stadiums, hard hats, steel beams, blueprints. Each weld symbolized collaboration. Mexican engineers, Canadian planners, American architects. 3 nations, 1 tournament? Yet, one man's words now threatened to fracture it all. Commentators began calling it the battle for the ball. Newspapers framed it as a referendum on identity. Is the World Cup America's show or humanity's celebration? For immigrant families across the U.S., the question cut deep. The World Cup had always been their home away from home, the one event where flags didn't divide but danced side by side. Now they watched as politics tried to redraw the lines. Back in Zurich, FIFA's press team drafted statements they never thought they'd need. Advisors debated tone, language, timing. Could they publicly challenge a sitting U.S. president? Could they afford not to? This was no longer about logistics or hosting rights. It was about principle, the invisible balance between national pride and global unity, between control and connection, between America first and the world together. And in that tension, in that impossible space between power and principle, FIFA found its moment. Because this wasn't just a response waiting to be written. It was a test of what the world still believed in. And that's exactly why FIFA decided to respond, not just to a man, but to a message. For Donald Trump, power was never just something to hold. It was something to perform. Every handshake, every headline, every tweet was a stage cue in a play he'd been writing since the 1980s, The Art of Control. From skyscrapers to boardrooms to the Oval Office, his gospel was simple. Dominance equals respect. And in his eyes, the world respected only those who demanded it. When he entered politics, that creed didn't soften. It sharpened. America First wasn't just a slogan. It was a declaration of hierarchy. Washington above Brussels, the U.S. above the UN, the dealmaker above the diplomat. The applause that followed him from campaign rallies into the White House reinforced his conviction that confrontation worked, that bluster could bend the world. He had tested it before. When NATO allies hesitated on defense spending, he threatened to walk away. When the United Nations criticized American policies, he laughed at the podium and called them a club for people to talk. To his supporters, it was refreshing candor, the sound of a leader unafraid to challenge stale institutions. To the rest of the world, it was something colder, the erosion of trust wrapped in swagger. Each time he pushed the line a little further. Each time the spectacle grew louder. Cameras followed, ratings soared, and Trump learned that diplomacy, when televised, could feel like reality TV. Negotiations became episodes. Allies became foils. The world wasn't a chessboard to him, it was an audience. And audiences, he believed, rewarded strength, not subtlety. That philosophy worked in business, where he could set terms and control outcomes. But on the global stage, it met resistance. The World Health Organization ignored his ultimatums. The Paris Climate Accord went on without him. Each withdrawal became both proof of his defiance and evidence of America's shrinking influence. Still, in Trump's narrative, walking away was winning, because staying meant compromise, and compromise was weakness. So when the 2026 World Cup entered the conversation, it was never just about soccer. It was about sovereignty, about who got to call the shots on American soil. The idea that a Swiss-based organization could dictate security procedures inside U.S. borders was unthinkable to him. "It's our land, our rules," he told advisors. "They play here, they play by our terms." What he didn't grasp, or refused to, was that FIFA wasn't a guest asking permission. It was an empire in its own right, a machine that transcended borders, languages, and politics. Every president before him, from Reagan to Obama, had treated FIFA with caution, a behemoth best managed through quiet diplomacy, not Twitter. But Trump saw neutrality as an obstacle, not a virtue. To him, FIFA's insistence on independence looked like insubordination. And that's where the contradiction cut deepest. The self-proclaimed master negotiator now demanding submission, not agreement. The businessman who built his empire on deals suddenly unwilling to make one. The man who valued image over process, now facing an institution that couldn't be bullied by branding. Inside Zurich, FIFA officials watched the storm unfold. The walls of their glass headquarters reflected flashing headlines. Trump threatens FIFA over security. World Cup may face political turbulence. Some officials laughed nervously. Others didn't. They dealt with corruption scandals, arrests, and bribery, but never this kind of pressure. Ideological, unpredictable, personal. Meanwhile, in Washington, aides scrambled to interpret the president's intent. Was it bluster or policy? Some whispered that he'd forget by morning. Others feared he'd double down. Every time the press asked for clarification, the silence deepened, an unspoken admission that no one truly knew. Across newsrooms, the narrative crystallized. This wasn't about safety. It was about control. Trump had drawn a line in the sand, one that dared FIFA to choose between principle and compliance.